Hello, 大家好, I'm Grace from Grace Mandarin Chinese. When learning Chinese, you might have noticed that sometimes native Chinese speakers like to add an actual word at the end of a sentence, such as a, ma, ba, ne. We call them sentence final particles. Have you ever wondered why so many sentence final particles exist in Chinese, but not in some other languages like English? In this video, not only will you learn why Chinese needs sentence final particles, you will also get to know their functions so you won't feel confused when you're learning them. 那话不多说，我们现在开始吧。In order to figure out why we need sentence final particles in Chinese, let's first talk about a hypothesis called the intonation particle hypothesis, made by the linguist Feng Shengli. This hypothesis deals with the relationships between intonation, tones, and sentence final particles. It states that sentence final particles and intonation are actually two sides of the same coin. That is, sentence final particles can be regarded as a variation of intonation. But wait a minute, why do some languages have sentence final particles and some don't? Well, you can guess the potential reason. It's likely because some languages have tones and some others don't. Tones in languages are produced by changing your vocal pitch to convey words' meanings, whereas intonation uses pitch variation to convey a speaker's attitude, emotion, or other nuance. Since both tones and intonations are conveyed through pitch, they kind of contradict each other. So if a language has both tones and intonations, it's kind of like having you and, say, one of your family members trying to live in one room. It's too crowded. In this case, you will probably try to find a new space for yourself, right? Intonation is actually doing exactly the same thing. With both tones and intonations crowded in the same space, we definitely need to give some more space for intonation. So sentence final particles are here to provide that extra space. However, keep in mind that it doesn't mean that all tonal languages don't change pitch to express intonation. In Mandarin Chinese, we still do it, but we also have our assistant sentence final particles to help us fully realize the function of intonation. We can change our pitch through these particles to express intonation. For example, in English, when you frame a statement as a question, often you will make the pitch of your voice high at the end of the sentence. Like, he's a teacher? However, when you're very certain about something, you will instead make the pitch of your voice at the end of the sentence low. Like, of course he is a teacher. In Mandarin, you can use the sentence final particle ma to do something similar. If you pronounce ma with a high pitch, it's used to ask a question. For example, 他是老师吗?他是老师吗? Is he a teacher? But if you pronounce it with a low pitch after a statement, like 当然他是老师嘛,当然他是老师嘛, it shows that the speaker thinks the statement is blatantly true without question. You can see that they even have two different characters. And just a reminder, ma, this word is very casual, so be careful using it. Here is another example. The particle ne can be placed after a question to make the question sound softer and more polite. And when it's used in a question, it's pronounced with a high pitch. For example, 你想吃什么呢?你想吃什么呢? What do you want to eat? 你想去哪里呢?你想去哪里呢? Where do you want to go? However, when ne is added after a statement for emphasis or exaggeration, it's pronounced with a lower pitch. For instance, 他一个人能吃5碗呢。他一个人能吃5碗呢。He can finish 5 bowls on his own. 我连电脑都没带呢。我连电脑都没带呢。 I didn't even bring my laptop. However, this high-low pitch difference does not apply to all of the sentence final particles in Mandarin. For example, a is a common sentence final particle, and instead of using a high pitch with a question, we often use a lower pitch. For example, 你不去啊？你不去啊？ You're not going? 他没带电脑啊？他没带电脑啊？ He didn't bring the laptop. When using a to express exclamation, we also pronounce it with a lower pitch. For instance, 这边好美啊，这边好美啊。It's so beautiful here. 你看他多聪明啊，你看他多聪明啊。Look at how smart he is. When you use a at the end of a statement with a higher pitch, it shows a tone of certainty. And depending on the context, it could sometimes sound like you're impatient or unhappy. For example, 他不去啊，他不去啊。He's not going. 我知道啊，我知道啊。I know. So you can see that since Chinese has tones, the use of pitch for intonation is limited. So we have our helper, sentence final particles, as a way to help us convey intonation. We can change our pitch through these particles. Now let's talk a little more about the IP hypothesis I mentioned at the beginning of this video. Since the use of pitch for tones and intonations are to some extent contradictory, this hypothesis predicts that all tonal languages have sentence final particles, and non-tonal languages don't have them, unless there are some other factors in them that affect intonation. I know that many of you who are watching my videos speak different languages, so I'm curious to find out whether this hypothesis holds true in your language. Please let me know in the comments below. Alright, that's all for today. If you want to learn the use of sentence final particles in Mandarin Chinese, I've made several videos as well as a PDF for your reference. You can find them through the link in the first comment below. 那如果你喜欢今天的影片，别忘记按赞、订阅和分享哦。Also, if you'd like to learn some daily Mandarin expressions, check out my Instagram, Grace Mandarin. 那我们就下次见喽，拜拜。